Okay, hi, I'm Faith McInerney, and I'd like to talk to you about Pluto Chiron. I've done quite a bit of work on it for the past few years, and I have something to share with you. The existing literature on Pluto Chiron, understandably, emphasizes emotional alienation and pain. And I'm not going to read the text, you can read that pretty well, but basically it emphasizes the emotional alienation and pain attribute. And it's true, Chiron symbolizes both the wound and its healing. The wound or healing can be physical or psychological. One of the main manifestations of the psychological manifestation of Chiron is alienation. But whether it's a physical or psychological wound, the wound is usually more apparent than the healing. Now, it's understandable that with a point like Chiron, that emotional pain is the focus. But there are concrete manifestations and delineations for Pluto Chiron. Chiron actually symbolizes a variety of damaged entities, even non-living entities. The range is from broken furniture to a broken economy. And the healer is the individual or the force that repairs or restores what's been damaged. From a concrete manifestation, Pluto has to do with resources, sex, and death. And we know about Pluto from the energetic standpoint. It has to do with force and transformation. But we're going to be focusing on the resources, sex, and death. The first time I ever saw Pluto Chiron operating, it was a progressed picture. And it was operating, it happened at the time of a workman's comp event, a workman's compensation event. And financial events connected to a wound happen all the time with Pluto Chiron. It happens on a personal level. It happens on a global level. That's actually what I went in looking for, was how Pluto Chiron would manifest financially, because I work with Pluto so much connected with resources. That was my first take on the whole thing. After probably years of looking at it, the big surprise was the frequency of achievers and sensations that were ignited, that ignited the masses and changed the world, like radio, TV, computers. Here's a chart for the day that the first radio was sold in 1920. And we can see that there's an exact square of Pluto and Chiron. So we know the impact of the first radio in the world, and we see at least one of the aspects that corresponded with the event. But not every aspect is as easy to spot as that square. So we're going to get technical for just a minute, because reading aspects is a two-step process. Reading horoscopes is a two-step process. It's understanding the meaning, which is what we're going to do today, but it's also identifying the aspect when it occurs. There are so many ways to see the occurrences of planetary contacts, which are aspects, a fancy way of saying aspects. Many ways to see aspects, both traditional and non-traditional. My experience is that to maximize the likelihood of seeing aspects when they occur is using both traditional and non-traditional formats. Now, what I'm about to tell you is really important. Your understanding of these aspects is completely unessential. You do not need to understand the aspects in order to understand the meaning of Pluto Chiron. You'll understand just as much about Pluto Chiron with or without understanding the techniques. However, when we're just reading one aspect, it is a good opportunity to kind of bone up on different techniques. And the next 3 slides are going to show the techniques that I use. We're going to use Steve Jobs as our illustration because there's 2 very good reasons to use Steve Jobs. Number 1, he was a world changer. And number 2, Pluto Chiron is not apparent in his traditional chart. The second way of looking at a chart, after we looked at we're going to be looking at one aspect in 4 different formats. Here we see the first format. The second format we're going to look at is what's called the 90-degree dial. And with the dial, any aspect, any planets that are in aspect will line up on an arrow and a dot. And it kind of looks like a square. There is Chiron on an arrow, and there's Pluto on a dot. And even though they're not square, they look like a square on the dial. So we've sort of had a breakthrough here. We can see an aspect that's not apparent on a traditional chart. Let's take it a step further, because in my opinion, the most efficient way to read hard aspects is to use the 22.5-degree dial. Very efficient, because the arrow points to every major hard aspect, and there are 16 of them, and they all look like a conjunction. By the way, you can see something that's also not apparent on his traditional chart, which is his Mars, Saturn, Neptune. It's another talk. At any rate, I also want to make the point that when I give you illustrations, I usually will take a slice. Like I took this slice out of here and enlarged it. Much easier to see. You get the point. Sometimes I won't even use the whole chart, just the slice. So now you know where that's coming from. The last format that we're going to use is the sort. And what the sort is the chart, any chart, in linear order. And there's 2 great things about the sort. First of all, you can see the orb. And that is great for progressions. And the other thing that's great is that you can use the sort for chart synastry. You will never have a more interesting experience with chart synastry than putting it on a sort. Different talk, just to say that it's super useful for both things. And when you do progressions, which we're going to see in a minute, we're actually going to be able to see the orb of the progression. Here we can see the orb of his Pluto Chiron aspect, which is 30 minutes. And that's a pretty good close orb. Now, what makes these 16 hard aspects major aspects? In my opinion, what makes them major aspects is that they are triggered by transits and progressions. And that's what makes them fall into the category of a major aspect. So for example, let's look at the transits and progressions for Steve Jobs when he had these important events with Apple. So he premiered the Apple II with, here's the chart we looked at a few minutes ago. And here we can see the transits. Transiting Pluto was 10 degrees of Libra. And we can see that transiting Pluto, we can see it on this slice of the chart, that it made a contact with both Pluto and Chiron, period. Here we see it on a sort, and we can, on the sort incidentally, when you're using progressions or synastry, the natal chart or chart A will be A, and the progressions or the transits or the second chart in the synastry will be chart B. So here we see at A, we see his natal Pluto Chiron, and here at B, we see transiting Pluto. So basically we're looking at this, lined up in linear order. We're able to see the sort. That's what we want you to look at. Now, here's the same, here are his progressions. When the Apple II premiered, progressed Pluto was 1 minute from natal Chiron. Here's the way it looked on a dial. But again, this is why we love the sort, because you can see the orb was 1 minute. Now here's when the Apple I debuted, and there was a Pluto, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, about when Pluto Chiron appears by transit without making a contact to the natal chart. It wasn't far. It wasn't far. His natal Chiron, just to give us some perspective, his natal Chiron was 2 of Aquarius, and transiting Chiron was 1 of Taurus. So we know it was close. It wasn't quite hitting the nail on the head. But we're going to talk more about this later, about how even a transit of Pluto Chiron, when it's not hitting your chart, still has a lot of energy. And we're also going to be looking at midpoints. The reason it's important to talk about midpoints, and also demystify them, they work precisely like aspects. They only get complicated when you're dealing with a lot of them. We're only going to be looking at one picture, one aspect, one midpoint picture, Pluto Chiron. And we're only going to be looking at 2 points at the midpoint of Pluto Chiron. The sun, and does Picasso have the sun? Yes, so Picasso has the sun at the midpoint of Pluto and Chiron. We see it on a sort there. It's 17 minutes orb. And this is how it's expressed. Equals sun equals Pluto Chiron. The other point that we're going to be looking at is what's called the Aries point. And the Aries point is called, what's it called? The world point, the world axis. I want to demystify that for our purposes also, that saying that the Aries point is essential in dial astrology, and that it's as important as the sun. And in my opinion, that's sort of all you need to know about it for today. And here we have another world changer, Elvis Presley. And Elvis had Pluto Chiron, had Aries equal Pluto Chiron, 11 minutes orb. We're going to talk about a few aspects that should be in your toolbox anyway. This has nothing to do with dials or sorts. These are just other ways of reading aspects that you really should be incorporating into your work, whether you decide to use anything else that you see today. And they are declinations, planetary nodes. Now, the planetary nodes of Chiron and Pluto travel very slowly. The north node of Chiron travels between the end of Libra and early Scorpio. And what's interesting about those degrees is that a lot of people that we both know are born with Pluto at the end of Libra and early Scorpio. And so they are Pluto Chiron people. They have a Pluto Chiron aspect. Sometimes it's the only way that you can see they have a Pluto Chiron aspect. The south node of Chiron travels between the last degrees of Aries and the first degrees of Taurus. So there we have our nodes of Chiron. The node of Pluto always travels 19, roughly within a few minutes of 19 Cancer north node and 20 Capricorn south node. And again, we're going to see people with Chiron at 19 of Cancer and 20 of Capricorn, and they will be Pluto Chiron people. This is where it shows up on your Solar Fire program if you haven't used it yet, and they're interesting and fun to look at. You will find out things about your natal chart that you never knew before if you look at your planetary nodes. The other point that I want to point out to you are called antitions. They work in the natal chart, they work by transit, and basically when planets are in these sign combinations, a planet in Cancer, a planet in Gemini, a planet in Leo, a planet in Taurus, When they add up to 30, they form an antitia. So for example, people, and a lot of people are born with Pluto in late Virgo, and they're born with Chiron in early Aries. So first of all, there's a chance they have Pluto Chiron natally. If they're born with Pluto in late Virgo and Chiron in early Aries, if it adds up to 30, they have a natal aspect. But everyone with Pluto in Virgo will have a transiting contact of Chiron. While Chiron is in Aries, it will form an aspect to Pluto in Virgo. You just need to subtract the degree of natal Pluto from 30 to find out the degree in Aries that Chiron needs to be to form the aspect. So back to delineation. Pluto-Chiron people distinguish themselves in a couple of ways. They influence their field, and as we saw with Jobs and Elvis and Picasso, sometimes they do way more than just influence their field. They can change the world. Some of them set a record. They're the fastest, or the first, or the only. That's setting a record. Sometimes they're singled out by an influential person who kind of hands them the power. Sometimes they attract attention. They cause a sensation. And those are some of the ways that Pluto-Chiron people distinguish themselves. But let's look at some events that occurred during a Pluto-Chiron transit. These are events that had a mass impact. You could say they caused a buzz. Not only the first radio, we looked at that a few minutes ago, but the first TV broadcast happened on a Pluto-Chiron contact. This was also the day that Hitler gave his first speech. Now we have the I have a dream aspect right next to it. These are the aspects that occurred the day that Martin Luther King gave this talk, I Have a Dream. The only thing these two events have in common in terms of Hitler's first speech and I Have a Dream is that they caught on. They created a buzz. They had an impact. The other big events, like the first radio, first TV, the first car ride, the first movie, the first rodeo, when you think about this and the role that country western has in the world, how the United States is really represented to a great extent by country western culture, and the first rodeo was a part of that. The first text message was a Pluto-Chiron event, and there it is, by the way. So those are the events. The other events were sensations, things also that were single events that caused a buzz, and the whole world was involved. Woodstock. I mean, the world wasn't involved at the moment, but eventually it became a symbol of a generation. And on the day that Woodstock took place, Pluto and Chiron were on the Aries point. The millennium of, I believe there was a conjunction of Pluto and Chiron on the millennium. And the bicentennial, which was a big event here. I know a lot of the viewers are going to be from other countries and aren't as familiar with U.S. culture, but the bicentennial was the 200th birthday, the USA 200th birthday, and it was a big deal. And those were the aspects, the Pluto-Chiron aspect. So we've talked about some of these Pluto-Chiron people who changed the world, some others in that same category of enormity, of immenseness, were Edison, Mark Zuckerberg. Let's go back to Picasso in a second. Leonardo da Vinci and Bill Gates. Now, here's the reason I want to go back to Picasso is that we've got a transit here. So first of all, we see his natal Sun equals Pluto Chiron. But here are the transits when he had his first show in a museum. It was kind of around his Chiron return. His Chiron is not actually in aspect to Pluto. It's too wide. I think it's more than 8 degrees. So we would, personally, I don't read it. But the transiting conjunction was exact. So it's equivalent to that Steve Jobs example of the Apple II debuting when Chiron formed an aspect to his Pluto Chiron, or in his case, I think it was Pluto to his Pluto Chiron. But these are natal Pluto Chiron people, and this is the far end of the extreme of people who make a world impact on the world. Pluto Chiron people, I should say media celebrities are often Pluto Chiron people. That's a better way of putting it. So people like Greta Thunberg, I think she'll have a greater impact than being a media celebrity, but that's what she is right now. But we think she's got, she's a more serious person in terms of world change than just being a media celebrity. But when they're on the cover of Time Magazine, Person of the Year, it puts them in the category of media celebrity. And same is true with AOC. Alexandra Octavia Cortez. We think she's more than a media celebrity. And we can see she has got a trine of Pluto and Chiron. This is a very typical Pluto Chiron. Again, let me rephrase that. When you see a title like Linsanity, this lasted a short time, this Linsanity. But when you see a title like that, because it caused a buzz, it was a sensation. It puts it into the category of Pluto Chiron. And I wonder if a lot of you even remember who Jeremy Lin was. Basketball player, incredible scoring. I'm sure he's still doing something today. He was that great, but he was really the buzz of the moment. Same is true with Clara Bow, that the name that they gave her, the It Girl, it embodies an energy of Pluto Chiron. She's got it. She's got the force that attracts people to her. And Clara Bow had Sun equals Pluto Chiron. Lindbergh, this is also true, that when they get a nickname like Lucky Lindy, they're very often they're the kind of sensation that attracts attention that corresponds with Pluto Chiron. And Lindbergh, with the Sun equal to 2204 and Pluto Chiron at 2108, less than a degree orb from each other, with lots of planets there. And his fame was no picnic. He was also the victim of a kidnapping. He achieved fame twice. When he crossed the Atlantic in a plane, first person ever to do that, and when his baby was kidnapped. You see it just very commonly, for example, when multiple births occur, because it's in the newspaper. Everybody's kind of interested when, 5 or 6 babies are born at the same time. Back in the day, 3 was enough. Now these people are interesting because, well, let's talk about the others. The Gosselin, what were they? Quintuplets? I forget. But the Gosselin family, they were born on a Pluto Chiron aspect. And the first big famous media celeb multiple births, the Dion quintuplets, also all born with Sun equals Pluto Chiron. Now I want to go back to these identical strangers. These kids were in the news last year. They were born on a Pluto Chiron transit. They got together in the 1970s. They were separated at birth, literally, triplets separated at birth, adopted by 3 different families, did not know that each other existed until the late 1970s. Some newspaper story came out that somehow connected them with each other. They all discovered each other. They got into the news again. Pluto was triggering their natal Pluto Chiron. Pluto was, I think, 19 degrees, or I forget, let me see, 21 degrees. And it triggered their natal Pluto Chiron. 21 degrees of Libra triggered that Pluto Chiron. Now, all these years later, Pluto at 21 degrees of Capricorn triggered their natal Pluto Chiron, and a movie came out about their discovering each other and sort of investigating the circumstances of their birth and why triplets were separated at birth, which was not a common occurrence. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there. Super interesting story. You know, it's interesting to read about if you haven't seen the movie. The concept of celebrity is a Pluto Chiron concept. And artists with Pluto Chiron in their natal chart are interested in celebrity. Woody Allen has the natal picture, and he is interested in celebrity. If you look at his movies through that lens, you'll see that there is, I mean, this one is obvious, and this one is obvious, but there is a focus on celebrity. Woody Allen, by the way, has the natal aspect. Andy Warhol had the natal aspect. He's actually the artist who's associated most with the concept of celebrity. But if you listen to David Bowie and kind of, again, listening through the lens or through the filter of celebrity, it's there. Bowie was born with the natal aspect, and he is actually kind of celebrity obsessed. The verbiage, leper messiah, is an interesting phrase, because it identifies the downside of celebrity, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And Kanye West, he has the natal picture, obsessed with celebrity, had this photo printed, and I think it speaks for itself. These are other events that happened on Pluto Chiron aspects. Beatlemania happened on an opposition. Sinatra mania happened on, let's call it a dot aspect. It's actually what's called a semi-octile, but we can call it a dot on the dial. And between the end of 69 and the beginning of 70, Pluto and Chiron formed an antitia. If we add there's Virgo and Aries, if we add them up, they come up to 30. And there was a lot of pop culture that became prominent at the end of 69 and early 70. Pop culture that's still with us, the Jackson 5 and Elton John, started with a Pluto Chiron transit. This was massive. Lucille Ball had the natal picture, Sun equals Pluto equals Chiron. And when her TV show debuted, and it was big, we're talking early 50s, there was nothing. When her TV show debuted, I Love Lucy, she had the transit of Chiron triggering her natal Pluto Chiron. And these are the celebs that we know that started out, they had their first important event happen on a Pluto Chiron contact. We just looked at I Love Lucy. Here are some others. Adele, natal Pluto Chiron, transit of, I think there's actually a transit of Pluto and Chiron here. Anyway, at least there's a transit of Pluto to her Pluto Chiron. Star Wars was released on a Pluto Chiron transit. Now this is fascinating because Lucas has Sun equals Pluto Chiron. But the Pluto Chiron transit made no contact to his natal chart. That's super important for you to remember when you're trying to use Pluto Chiron for your own work, for premiering, for debuting your own work. Here's another example of that, where Matt Groening has, this is the guy who created The Simpsons, he's also got a natal inconjunct of Pluto and Chiron. Pluto and Chiron in conjunct. His show debuted with a trine of Pluto and Chiron, forming a trine, but they don't contact his natal chart. He's got the natal picture. He started his show on a trine, but the aspect did not contact his natal chart. And here we go. This is another example, the Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz started shooting when transiting Chiron was conjunct Judy Garland's Pluto. It was conjunct her ascendant also. I mean, we could actually discuss the Wizard of Oz from the standpoint of the whole psychological alienation of the wizard, but that's another story. At any rate, transiting Chiron was conjunct her Pluto. She had no natal aspect, but the day that the Wizard of Oz began shooting, there was a conjunction of transiting Chiron to Pluto. Very important for you to remember in your own life, in your own world. Now that's also true with Taylor Swift. I'm not quite sure what she's doing sort of on the tail end of this, but that was true of Taylor Swift. Well, she had Pluto trine Chiron natally and transiting Pluto opposite Chiron when she made her first viral video. Here are the leaders that had Pluto Chiron. Gandhi had it in his natal chart, and when he became a hero, there was some meeting with the British, and kaboom, he came home a hero. Transiting Chiron triggered his natal Pluto. In fact, it was 2 degrees from a conjunction. This is kind of wide. You'll notice we don't often use a 2-degree conjuncting aspect, but it was such a big deal that I widened the orbs a little bit here. But ordinarily, if I'm sharing it with you, I try to keep it, as tight as possible. Now, Mao was already a big deal, but in 1969, they made him a greater big deal. He got elevated to godlike status. So he had the natal picture of Jupiter on the Pluto-Chiron midpoint, and transiting Pluto was conjunct, again, 1 degree away from natal Chiron. Elizabeth I, we could sort of say she was the it girl of the time. She became a fashion fad. She liked a lot of sweets. Her teeth went bad. Her teeth got black. People let their teeth go black. They blackened. By the way, they used soot to blacken their own teeth to follow the fad of looking like Queen Elizabeth I. And there's her natal chart. Here's Eva Perón. Her face, if you go to Argentina, her face, if you go into a tourist store, you can still buy a mug with her face or a t-shirt with her face. There's her Pluto Chiron. And people who are alive today, Barack Obama, Putin, these are Pluto Chiron leaders. Very charismatic, loved by the public, by their public. Now, there are the other kinds of Pluto Chiron distinctions. People who distinguish themselves in their field, they set a record, they make a list, they're first, the best, fastest. They may have an honorific, like Godfather of Soul. James Brown has a Pluto Chiron aspect. Or the fastest man alive, Usain Bolt, had the Pluto Chiron aspect. This is a more everyday Pluto Chiron aspect. I saw this in the chart of a client's mother. I saw she had Pluto Chiron, and I asked the client about her mother. I never knew that about her mom. And she told me her mom was the first female insurance agent in the Bronx. That is a much more normal, everyday manifestation of natal Pluto Chiron. Sometimes an influential person can help you out, but that can happen with or without a transit. The distinctions are usually desirable, but they're not always. People who are the worst, the slowest, they're also Pluto Chiron people. Why? This is a question that I asked myself for a long time. Pluto's presence and role in an influential mass event, that's easy to grok. That's really easier to understand what Pluto's role is in that kind of event. But why would Chiron be present in situations that are desirable? That had me stymied for a long time. And then I realized that we have clues in the words for these phenomena. Manias, crazes, fanatics, viral. These are pathologies. Okay, so that settled my mind about that. But what is it about the fastest, the first, the most? What about them? Why is Chiron an attribute of those charts and a part of that aspect in those charts? Well, that took a lot of thinking, and this is my best take on that so far. It's because those people have distinguished themselves from other people. And when you stand apart from other people, even for a good reason, you separate yourself, you make yourself distinct, and that is an attribute of Chiron. So I spoke to the daughter of that first female Bronx insurance agent, and apparently that woman took a lot of abuse for being the first female insurance agent in the Bronx. And I think that also brings us back to the leper messiah thing, is that these people are on some level, because they are separate from the rest of us, people look at them differently. Here's what's important or one of the things that's important for you guys, is to watch Pluto, not only your Pluto Chiron contacts, but Pluto Chiron contacts, period. But let's talk about yours for a second, for professional activity. Even if you do not have a natal aspect, like Judy Garland, when you have a transit, progression, or solar arc of Pluto and Chiron, your work is likely to be more visible. Your work is likely to attract more attention. We haven't seen examples of this, but a successful person may help you professionally at the time of a Pluto Chiron contact. So my suggestion to you for science, consider starting or releasing your work at the time of a Pluto Chiron contact, especially if you have the natal aspect. Remember, if you're looking for a Pluto Chiron aspect to release your work to the public, don't just look at transits and progressions. Look at transits and progressions, but don't forget to look at your solar arcs. These are going to be the things, the transits and solar arcs, that'll be the most frequent. Aspects between transiting Pluto and Chiron and transiting Pluto and transiting Chiron are very powerful, but they're more rare. It's more likely that it's going to hit, you're going to have a transit in your own chart, or you're going to have a solar arc in your own chart, more frequent. But even if you don't have the natal picture, there will be more of a buzz at the time you have a Pluto Chiron contact. Now, you'll notice I use the word buzz and attracting attention. I don't use the word success, because it doesn't guarantee success. It's more likely that your work is going to be seen. It's more likely you're going to get attention. That's true whether you have the natal Pluto Chiron picture or not. And we've seen how many popular works were launched with transiting Pluto Chiron in aspect, even when there was no natal aspect. Here's another example of that. This is a guy who had cancer, he had a leg removed, and to raise consciousness about cancer, and actually, I think it was a fundraiser, he ran the length of Canada with a prosthesis. When he began, transiting Pluto was trine natal Chiron. Transiting Pluto was trine natal Chiron. transiting Pluto was trine natal Chiron. No natal aspect, not on a dial, not on a sort, nowhere, but there was a transiting aspect. Now, I guess this one. I wasn't looking for Pluto Chiron when I read his, I forget if I read his obituary or his wiki, I forget, but I read his biographical material, and I'm reading this stuff. He finishes the run. He's met by a brass band. Thousands of people are lining the streets. They're giving him a police escort. His efforts resulted in a worldwide legacy. I thought, that sounds like Pluto Chiron. Now, to be candid, I wasn't sure where that was going to go. I didn't know whether he had the natal picture. I had no idea. All I knew was that sounds like Pluto Chiron. And sure enough, he had an exact trine when he started. So everything is symbolized in more than one way. And there are other aspects that correspond with popularity. For example, Jerry Seinfeld, again, this is an American reference point. I think Seinfeld is probably pretty popular around the world. It's huge here. He had no natal Pluto Chiron, no aspect of Pluto Chiron, and I looked at every rock that I could, no aspect that I could find. Did just fine without Pluto Chiron. But that says a lot. It says a lot about the frequency of the correspondence that you can actually point to the exceptions as being exceptions. Part 2, Pluto Chiron and finance. Now this is what I actually went in looking for. Plutonian is spelled with an O, by the way. This is what I went in looking for because I tend to focus on concrete events. And my take on Pluto is that it corresponds with resources. When you're looking for money in a chart, and number one, look for Pluto pictures. And when you're looking at Pluto pictures, consider resources as a delineation. So if you look at Pluto as resources and Chiron as an injured entity, and you combine the two, here are some of the ways that they manifest. Keeping in mind, by the way, that we're talking about an injured entity. Sometimes it'll be a person, sometimes it won't be a person. Here's a person. Compensation that's connected with injury is a Pluto Chiron event. Remember, that was the first time I ever saw Pluto Chiron, was when I saw a workers' comp event happen at the time of a progressed Pluto Chiron picture. That was my first kind of clue as to what it meant. It also has to do with financial assistance to needy people, like charities and subsidies. It'll have to do with not just inheritance, but actually more likely to be disinheritance, because we're looking at an injury. So the disinheritance is an attribute of that. Financial mismanagement is very common Pluto Chiron event, and taxes and tax avoidance. Tax actually shows up a different way. It's not just Pluto Chiron, but it does include Pluto Chiron as well. So I think we're safe in talking about it. Tax avoidance, on the other hand, is more of a Pluto Chiron kind of event. Even when Pluto Chiron operates in the other way and the person is a sensation or changes the world in some way or is the first or fastest, when they have a transit, a financial event is very likely to occur. When they have a progression, a financial event is very likely to occur. In other words, it doesn't inoculate you against the financial issues of Pluto Chiron. These are the philanthropic and charitable events that happened on transits. The Elizabethan Poor Laws, named after Elizabeth, we've looked at her Pluto Chiron before. It was being triggered by Jupiter at the time. Here's the date. This is really the first charity, the Elizabethan Poor Laws. The first workers' insurance happened when transiting Pluto was conjunct Chiron. That happened in Germany. Medicare and Medicaid was announced when transiting Pluto and Chiron were in aspect, and LBJ who launched this, had progressed Jupiter precisely on his Pluto-Chiron midpoint. Going back to charities, the guy who founded the Salvation Army, by the way, this is what a declination looks like. Whatever else you're using or not using from this talk, you should be using declinations. The founder of Goodwill, the founder of the Red Cross, they're all Pluto-Chiron, Pluto-Chiron, Pluto-Chiron people. Back to the social welfare programs, when FDR was elected, he took the U.S. out of a depression, rescued the economy. This is where we see the healer part of Pluto-Chiron in terms of a non-living entity that was rescued. And Ronald Reagan, when the Social Security Reform Act was signed, Ronald Reagan had transiting Pluto trine his natal Chiron. Transiting Pluto trine his, he's got a natal Chiron, here we go, trine his natal Chiron. Here are some charitable individuals. Bill Gates has what's called a minor aspect. By the way, both Gates and Buffett have these minor aspects. We're not dwelling on minor aspects today, but you know, I use them in my own work, and it's interesting that they have the identical minor aspect in their respective charts. Anyway, we scale down Bill Gates' charts. You know, he has a whole chart, but we scaled it down, we stripped it down to see that transiting Chiron was opposite his natal Pluto when he and Warren Buffett launched the Giving Pledge, where they got 81 billionaires to give most of their wealth to charitable causes. It started in 2010, and this is what's happened since then. It started with 81 billionaires, and it's now up to 209 billionaires. Buffett had an almost identical picture with Chiron, with Gates. It was Chiron opposite Pluto, and with Buffett, it was transiting Pluto in aspect to his natal Chiron. It was a semi-square, and that's the way it looked on a dial. These were some other super charitable people at the time that they were super charitable. An actress, Jamie Gertz, she was nominated the most, or named the most charitable celebrity. She got the title in 2012. Transiting, what do we look at? Progressed Pluto was exact with her Pluto-Chiron midpoint, and she was named the most charitable celebrity. Ted Turner, he has a natal Pluto-Chiron aspect, and when he donated $1 billion to something, transiting Chiron triggered his natal Pluto-Chiron aspect. He's got a very complicated Pluto-Chiron picture, including Mercury. That's another talk also. Oh, we're done. Now, here is an ordinary person, a beloved astrologer who's recently passed, no natal aspect of Pluto-Chiron. She's part of the Chiron and Capricorn generation, so they're getting transiting Pluto conjunct their Chiron. At some point, while Pluto is in Capricorn, it will conjunct all the natal Pluto, all the natal Capricorn Chirons. And when transiting Pluto was conjunct her Chiron a few years ago, she moved to the top of the list for subsidized housing and moved into a luxury apartment at a subsidized rent at the time that transiting Pluto was conjunct her natal Chiron. Now, it works on a mass level. These are all of the events that happened on, or I should say, all of the Pluto-Chiron contacts that happened during manias followed by crashes. The first big investment craze followed by a crisis was the tulip bubble, 1600s, Netherlands. And this is a page, this is actually my favorite slide in this part of the presentation, because we've got this chart and we've got this chart. We can see that Pluto is an aspect to Chiron on this chart, and we can see the date and the chart for the mania and the crash. And we've got 4 of those. We've got another chart for the South Sea bubble. And we've got this chart for the top of the bubble and the crash. And we've actually got a date for when the top of that bubble happened. The crash of 1929, here it shows up by transit. We see this chart, and then we can look at this chart. Here's the top, there's the crash, the top, and this day, that day corresponded with these transits. And the banking crisis of 2007, actually there were two contacts here. Pluto and Chiron were traveling together. But on this date in 2007, the first bank closed. There was also an event in France where the first, I forget what happened in France, but it was a parallel event where a bank refused its first lender or something like that. And it was right at the same time, and it corresponded with this same transit. And there we see this is the date that the bank closed, apparently started the ball rolling with that banking crisis, and the market crash happened. Little bit of an orb there, but certainly within orb. So not only do we see social welfare and financial crises with Pluto Chiron, but when you see the two combined, sometimes you see revolutions in the world. So sometimes you'll see the revolution itself. The French Revolution happened on I think it's this is a little small for me to read. I'm not sure if that's a trine or what. Let's see if I can get right up to it. What have we got? Chiron and Pluto. I believe that's a trine. Not sure, believe it or not, even with 2 pairs of glasses. I think hopefully you'll see that a little better than I can. But it happened on a major aspect of Pluto and Chiron. But the other situations we're going to look at are people who, well, not all of them. We're going to look at a few slides of people who ignited revolutions that were based on social welfare and financial crises. So Karl Marx had the natal picture, and when he published Das Kapital, he was having his Chiron return. He had a natal Pluto-Chiron conjunction, and when he published Das Kapital, his natal Pluto-Chiron conjunction was triggered by transiting Chiron. The Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin had transiting Pluto square his natal Chiron. When Castro nationalized the Cuban economy, transiting Pluto trined his natal Chiron. When Hugo Chavez nationalized the Venezuelan economy, transiting, he had a natal quincunx, and transiting Pluto semi-squared his natal Chiron. In other words, there was a Pluto-Chiron contact to his natal chart when he nationalized the Venezuelan economy. And this is also an event rather than a person. When the Chinese free market socialism, they called it, was introduced, there was a Pluto-Chiron aspect. And you see this also with Pluto-Chiron. There are changes of currency. Currency is abandoned, withdrawn. When there are currency changes, it's common with a Pluto-Chiron picture. Now, let's talk a little bit about financial damage and financial crime. When Martha Stewart was indicted for insider trading, well, you don't see this all the time, progressed Pluto was conjunct her natal Chiron to the minute, and she was indicted for insider trading. This was the chief executive of Weiwei, is that the way you pronounce it? That huge Chinese media giant. She was arrested, also, financial fraud. And transiting Pluto was transiting Chiron was on the Antisha of natal Pluto. She falls into this generation we were talking about earlier, that Pluto and Virgo generation that are sooner or later going to get that transit of Chiron and Aries to their natal Pluto. While Chiron is in Aries, they're going to get that transit sooner or later. Madoff had a bunch of pictures at the natal Pluto Chiron midpoint. Here's a bank CEO who testified in front of Congress for unethical bank practices. He's in that Chiron and Capricorn generation. Transiting Pluto was conjunct his natal Chiron. He has, and also transiting Chiron was quincunx his natal Pluto. He had it both ways. And you see it with other kinds of crimes. Netanyahu is right now being indicted. Transiting Pluto is hitting all. He's got a natal Pluto Chiron. What has he got? No, he doesn't have natal Pluto Chiron. He's got transiting Pluto triggering his natal Chiron. He has got, we talked about that. And he has a solar arc of Pluto Chiron hitting the midheaven when he was indicted. Other kinds of crimes, Charlie Sheen was the victim of an extortion threat when he had transiting Chiron opposite Pluto. Here's a guy who lost out on a $120 million severance package. He was part of that. He was on the wrong side of the Me Too movement, and he was fired for it. And transiting Pluto hit his natal Chiron when he lost his big severance. So sometimes there's a financial injury without a crime. And an example of that is tariffs. So for example, when President Xi, this was back in the day, we're doing this after the virus has hit, and I made this a PowerPoint way before the virus. So this was when transiting Pluto was conjunct President Xi's natal Chiron, because he's in that generation, and Trump presented him with a tariff problem. Same thing for Trudeau. He had transiting Chiron opposite natal Pluto, same thing. Trump presented him with a tariff problem. He had a Pluto Chiron aspect at the time. Inheritance issues. A lot of us have this sooner or later. This woman lost her inheritance on the day when transiting Pluto triggered her natal Pluto Chiron picture. This is a person I know personally who transiting Pluto was conjunct natal Chiron, transiting Pluto conjunct natal Chiron. No natal picture, transiting conjunction, huge inheritance problem. And here's an example of somebody who won. I mean, it was baptism by fire. She went through, it was sort of you wouldn't ask for the experience to have to fight for your inheritance in court, but that happened. Picasso's daughter was disinherited. Her mother actually challenged the will. They won, and Paloma Picasso, this is Pablo's daughter, had progressed Pluto and Chiron 1 minute or from each other. And this is a progress to progress, B to B, progress to progress. I did a little study of bankruptcies. 65% of people who had bankruptcies had the natal aspect. And of those 15, 12 of those 15 had a transit in contact at the time they declared bankruptcy. So Pluto Chiron also has to do with imposing and avoiding tax. The guy who imposed the U.S. tax, President Wilson, he had the natal aspect, and much easier to read on a sort, and progressed Pluto was awfully close to his Chiron. He had the natal aspect, to be sure, and progressed Pluto was awfully close, sort of a matter of time till there was a big financial event. Here was the first tax, the first UK tax, 600 years. It's still being used. From the year 1300, it's still being used. It happened on a Pluto-Chiron contact. Even the last tax aspect, the last tax act in the US was introduced in November of 2017. It happened with a Pluto-Chiron contact. And by the way, Trump had progressed Pluto to natal Chiron. He had it by a 64, he had it by a minor aspect, but he did have the aspect. There you go with tax and tax avoidance. So we've been talking about the Pluto and Chiron generation, and a lot of you are in that generation. And here's an example of huge celebrity, incredibly successful person, no natal Pluto Chiron, by the way, but he's in the Pluto and Virgo generation, transiting Chiron when it was 2 degrees of Aries, triggered that natal Pluto. He tried to take Tesla public. He tried to take his company public, and actually he does have a wide aspect. It's less than 1 degree orb, sun at the midpoint. Anyway, he tried to take Tesla public when transiting Chiron was hitting his natal Pluto. We know what happened. It was not successful, and there we go. So we saw with Picasso's daughter, by the way, that it's not 100% guaranteed that what you do, financially speaking, on a Pluto-Chiron transit is not successful, but you run into a lot of crap, and you can avoid it. If you're an astrology person and you can avoid taking something, doing a big financial thing when Pluto is on your Chiron or Chiron is on your Pluto, you probably want to. There's a lot of alternative symbolism, by the way, for financial problems. We're not going to go through every one of them, but just saying there are many pictures for financial issues. Now, I think we've made this point, whether or not somebody is a huge influence in their field with Pluto Chiron, when they get the transit or progression, the likelihood that they're going to have a financial event is major. And that happened to Freud also, that he made the huge impact on the world, but when he had the progression, he had a hard time getting out of Germany because he was trying to avoid the flight tax, and that's what happened to him. This is the story of a German entertainment sensation. And I love this example because it's so illustrative of Pluto Chiron. And also I saw it coming. You love the things that you can kind of guess. And with Pluto Chiron, it's kind of easy to guess. So the story of this guy is that he was an young unknown soldier. He wrote a love poem to the girl he left back home, period. Somebody turned that poem into a song, and it became Adolf Hitler's favorite song. And every night, before they went to sleep, they would play that song. It was called Lily Marlene. And everybody in the German army would hear that song before they went to sleep. So again, when I hear that kind of story, I think, hey, that sounds like Pluto Chiron. And there we've got the guy who's got the natal square. And apparently it's still a very big deal song in Germany. I've never heard it, but there we go. Sex. Oh, we almost finished without talking about Pluto Chiron and sex. So, when we get to the bottom of this slide, we're going to talk about how I really don't understand why Pluto Chiron, I can't wrap my head around the verbiage of Pluto, Chiron, and sex. So I'm just going to talk about the illustrations. When Woody Allen was busted with the photos of his, at that time, his stepdaughter, he had progressed Chiron equal progressed Pluto 1 minute orb. Transiting Pluto was stationing, squaring Mia Farrow's son. Different story. But Woody Allen had Pluto Chiron, 1 minute orb. When Pee Wee Herman was arrested twice for, I think one time was for exposure and one time, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just saying, you know, he was arrested twice for these sexual transgressions, let's call them for one of them. Anyway, we see he has the natal Pluto Chiron picture, and transiting Chiron, on one of his arrests, transiting Chiron triggered the natal picture. Roger Stone, who would have thought it? He's got the natal Pluto Chiron picture, and when transiting Jupiter, this was a long time ago, when transiting Jupiter triggered his Pluto Chiron symbolism, he made the front page of, this looks like the National Enquirer, he made the front page of something or other about being involved in a group 6 ring. Now, I did not make up chaste passion. When I read about Wuthering Heights, you know, the author of Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte, had natal Pluto Chiron, and you know, I'm researching away, and I didn't, you know, I was looking for sexual manifestations, but I hadn't quite wrapped my head around anything at that point. And then I read this verbiage. I didn't make it up. I read it in a review of Wuthering Heights, chaste passion. That got my attention because Emily Dickinson, these two people died virgins, by the way. Emily Bronte and Emily Dickinson, they both died virgins. And, but they were not non-sexual people, obviously. And Emily Dickinson, among the things that were found in her papers were what are called the master letters. And they're about submission, sexual submission, to an unknown imaginary master. And there we've got a quote from the master letters. And there's Emily Dickinson's sword. Now, I did a study of necrophiles. Amazingly enough, on Astro Theme, there are a bunch of necrophiles. A huge portion of them had Pluto Chiron natal aspects, and they also had transits at the time that they were discovered. Now, you could say that they were sensations. If you want to make the news, a way of doing it is, you know, perform necrophilia and admit it, or have people find out about it. You will make the headlines. So there's another way of looking at necrophilia in that it's a sensational news event. But my opinion is that it had something to do with the actual predilection. So we can talk about what ties all of these together. Alienation is part of it. Power is part of it. Association with death is part of it. But at this point of my understanding, there's got to be some more mainstream sexual proclivities than something you get arrested for or something that makes the front page of a newspaper. I don't know. Maybe that it's a sexual predilection at variance with your public persona. I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what ties, the verbiage that will tie all of these together. But that's where I'm at with it so far. Now, death is not the most common occurrence at a Pluto-Chiron contact, but it does happen. And, but interestingly enough, Elijah Cummings was just recently died. He did not have the natal picture. But when he died, he had a transit and progression. He had a transit, and here's the progression. The progression was Oh, here's the progression. B to B, 2 minutes away. We don't know his time of birth, but I did him for 12 a.m. and I did him for 11 p.m. and it's not going to be wider than 2. This is the widest orb, is the 2 minutes. So when he died, he was the first African-American lawmaker to lie in state. So he was a first. And it's true, it was occasioned by his death. But even at the time of his death, there was the quality of being the first at something. Now, sometimes this is actually something you see a fair amount, where one's advancement involves a deceased person. So Joel Osteen has the natal picture. He's a televangelist, and he is huge televangelist. He has the natal picture, but when his father died, his father just sort of handed him the reins of the ministry. It happened with transiting Pluto. In fact, I think he also had the progression and the transit of Pluto and Chiron. And you see Pluto Chiron with a lot of religious leaders who attracted a big following. Brigham Young to Timothy Leary, that's a range of religious leaders who caused a buzz, attracted lots of people. That's parenthetical, by the way. It has nothing to do with death. Back to death. In art and literature, when you see Pluto Chiron, it commonly has to do with where death is in the title. And on transits, we also see things like capital punishment laws and events with graves or burying. The Kennewick Man, prehistoric man, was discovered on a Pluto Chiron transit. So this is the last slide. These are just 3 typical days where there was a transit of Pluto Chiron. Pluto Chiron transits are not common, but they're not that rare. And so what's common, what they have in common is you'll see the birth of somebody who's influential or a cultural influence that was widespread. You'll see a financial event. You'll see an event that has to do with death, burial, and depth, with that aspect of Pluto. And we haven't talked about this really, but we'll see a thread here that earthquakes, I shouldn't say earthquakes happen on Pluto Chiron transits. I say that when there's a Pluto Chiron transit, an earthquake is common. So these are good examples of Pluto Chiron transits. Here's one back in 1911, earthquake, financial event, famous person born. Not just famous, hugely influential. This guy started Scientology. 1992, Pluto Chiron. New catechism, widely influential. The Chinese switch to the free market, the socialist free market. The British withdrew the pound sterling. The Cartoon Network, the first animated channel, went on TV, and big earthquake, big miners' demonstration. Famous person born, Cardi B. I don't know her. Apparently she's a big deal. Only woman to win an award as a solo rap artist. That makes her the Pluto Chiron type. Just the only woman to win that award. And more recently, we don't know the influential person yet who was born the week of August, in August 2007. But here's the other big financial event that I was looking for, that a French bank blocked a withdrawal. I guess there's more than one bank that was said to start that financial crisis, but both of those events happened with Pluto Chiron. Big earthquake, and I mean, this isn't exactly something we've looked at, but it happened quite at that time, so it's interesting to consider. So here I am, this is me. This is my blog. You know, the reason I did Pluto Chiron first off is Pluto Chiron was most recently the most frequently clicked posting on the blog. It's interesting that the posting about something that goes viral, Pluto Chiron, became the most relative to my life, became the most viral on my blog. There's my email address. This is episode 1, volume 1 of Midpoint Observatory on YouTube. Join us for more. We're going to be doing Chiron and the other outer planets as we go along. There's lots to talk about. There's a lot on the blog, and there's a lot of material, and I hope you'll join me again. Thanks so much. Good luck. God bless. Bye-bye.